Well, I'm very international.
Basically, let me talk a little bit about what I'm doing or have been doing. The European Crowdfunding Network, of which Invesdor is a member, and Tero has been elected to our board. He elected a new board this summer, so there's a good representation in the organization also for Finnish people. The European Crowdfunding Network is becoming a professional trade association for the sector, which is a very young sector, as you know. We were founded 2.5 years ago, a Brussels-based non-profit with international focus. We have now something like 55 members, of which 35 are platforms, roughly. The rest are lawyers, we even have banks, we have consultants, KPMG and so on. So these are organizations that believe in crowdfunding or crowdfinancing structures and want to explore this and drive professionalism and development in that direction. ECN has spent the first years so far in educating policymakers, partly on national level and of course on European level. We initiated basically the discussions that happen at the European Commission. When we started, we published our first white papers and put them into the Commission. There was a low-level interest there, but there was no high-level action. Since then, of course, we've seen crowdfunding involved in many of the discussions at the Commission. We talk about capital market union, and crowdfunding is mentioned in there. When we talk about the prospectus directive, and the Commission looks at this, and crowdfunding is part of it. We've seen that the old Commission has had actions focused on crowdfunding, large conferences even within Brussels. And we see that a lot of funding is being allocated from the European Commission with regard to crowdfunding. So they have these research grants and support actions they finance in order to develop knowledge, but also standards. And of course, we benefit from that as well. So this is how we mostly finance us. We are now 5 staff, including myself, as of Monday. Nobody's full-time, but we're still 5 people. We have an office in Brussels with a view of the Parliament. So if any of you comes to Brussels, you can visit us. We are subletting, subrenting from a large consultancy to very good terms. And we have established a professional network with like-minded organizations in Brussels that at first sight don't necessarily seem to be friends of crowdfunding, like the European Banking Federation, the Federation of Stock Exchanges, the Venture Capital Association, the Business Angel Networks, BAE and IBAN both, incubator networks, EBN, and other organizations like ACA, the Global Accounting Group, the CFA Institute. And we work with these organizations, not constantly, but every now and then, to develop ideas of how we can change regulation or foster a unified market across Europe for certain aspects of the financial and investment chain. So this is ECN. But we want to talk a bit about equity crowdfunding or equity-like crowdfunding structures. Mostly, this is, I understand, what Invesdor is mostly doing. It's also, I used to work for the European Venture Capital Association. I used to work in did buyout and with venture capital and business angels. So this is what I understand a bit better. Even though today the lending side in some countries seems to be much more exciting. And we see much more scale. And we see much higher investment rounds from institutional investors in these platforms. On the equity side, though, there's a lot happening. The market is something like 3 years old. I think the oldest platforms are a bit older, but really you've seen since the last 3 years quite a lot of new platforms coming out in maybe more or less every country in Europe. We still have very few platforms that have scaled. I don't know how many you know, but it's potentially there's 3-5 platforms that have really scaled to a level where you say, okay, none of them are probably yet really established in the market where you say they will be there in 5 or 10 years as well. But the big names like Crowdcube, I think they're fairly much established. And you have platforms like Seeders in the UK that getting there, Companisto or Seedmatch in Germany that might get there as well. And in France, we see Alternativa. But what we haven't seen yet is the professionalization of the sector that leans itself to established financial services. And today there is, to my knowledge, 2 platforms that have a full MiFID license. One is Invesdor, and Invesdor is basically the only crowdfunding platform that has been doing that. And the other one is Alternativa in France, which actually is an MTF and operated already since 10 years as a mini stock exchange. And just realized over the last years that what they have been doing is very close to crowdfunding, and now they also call it crowdfunding. And they basically are a market where you also issue secondary sales. So we have with Invesdor, and I'm very excited about that. We don't know if it works, but I'm very excited about it. Inspire. We have the first time that a crowdfunding platform openly, well, it's actually the second time, we had a German platform that had a banking license and then returned the license because they couldn't make money with that. But we have the first time that a platform has a full license with the intention to scale not only within their own country, but also across borders. And that is, for me, a step of, let's say, development within the industry that brings us closer to other financial services and shows the potential of professionalism within our sector. So we don't know yet if it works, but I'm very excited about it. There will be a lot of hurdles when we talk about regulation and with different regulators all in all our 28 countries. So this is really exciting challenge. We have seen other platforms in the equity side trying to expand across Europe before. It's not the first time, but no one was successful so far. And they had different business models. You know, Funded by Me, which is a Scandinavian platform, which had an extension and opening offices across Europe and then closing them down. Crowdfunding has done the same, not successful because they had to apply local regulation. They couldn't centralize certain activities at home, as it is hopefully possible with a license. And we've seen a small Austrian platform also trying to expand this year. And we likely will see the same happening with them that happened with the other platforms. Because if you want to scale within each country, within your team, you need a lot of money. And none of these platforms had that kind of capital. So that's, for me, on the equity side, one of the really interesting things. And the other very interesting thing is, and for me as a German, it's actually not that new, but it's that equity investments or share holdings in startups or SMEs as a financial instrument is being, let's say, not replaced, but there's new financial instruments that are being also offered. So where we started out with the pure equity participations, we ended up in tiny partnerships. In Germany, we use subordinated loans, and we now also see bonds being issued, or companies looking at that. So we see the diversification of the financial instruments that are being offered for investors. So that helps investors to allocate their capital differently, adjust their risk portfolio if they want, and maybe also take less risky participations and mix them with higher involvement in other investments. So that becomes very interesting for a professional investor as well, and this is how this sector can operate. And so potentially we will see more and more diversification, specialization as well. And so as an investor, we may have the opportunity to just allocate money across different types of investments through crowdfunding platforms. We become very efficient. We can stay at home. We can do that online to a large part. You don't have to sit in offices anymore and discuss with people directly. You build a network. We see the club finance deal increasing as well, where we see certain lead investors taking the lead. Some platforms even make that their role. You have a question?
Yes. I don't know if you have questions at the end.
You can ask whenever.
Yes. What's the typical project you see going through, like in terms of size, like the product? Do you see crowdfunding as a substitute for seed funding, for instance?
So basically, I'm not sure if there is a typical product. We see it depends on platform to platform, and it depends on country to country as well. Where you have on some platforms there's very clear focus on innovative technologies. They say we only take projects like this, and you have platforms that say we take anything. So if you're a salad maker and you want to expand across Helsinki and open little salad bars, they will also finance you. So they don't have. This happened on Crowdfunding, for example. So you don't have a specific focus necessarily across the industry. You may have that by platform. And so it's very difficult to say there's a typical thing. but I think it has already replaced seed finance to a certain degree. You know, if you look at the overall market size in the last 3 years, I mean, if you take the top layer, like take Crowdcube, they invested £100 million in 3 or 4 years. If you calculate that as a VC fund with an investment horizon of say 7 years before they start exiting, then in the next 3 years they will maybe invest another 50 million to 70 million. So that will be basically a £170 million seed fund over the span of 7 years. For a first-time fund, that would be very good. You go out and try to raise a €170 million seed fund as a first-time fund manager. So that's of course the largest platform. But I think there is already the replacement of some activity happening. And we know that on some platforms, I can't talk for Invesdor, but if I look into the room, I believe it might be true here as well, that a large number of the investors that are investing through some of these platforms are actually what we would, or what the Brits would call sophisticated investors. Business angels, sometimes even family offices. On some platforms, it's estimated to be 70% of the money flowing through the platform comes from these types of sources. So, and then it becomes clearly some form of replacement or a new tool to allocate money alongside maybe their traditional investment strategies. Your neighbor had a question as well.
You mean platform is like a crowdfunding operator? Right now.
Yeah, so for me, platform, exactly. Again, you can't really simplify that.
The licensor or the crowdfunding operator.
You have a crowdfunding platform is basically the website. Okay. That is a marketplace. And depending on the country you operate in, say where you have regulation, and I won't talk about Finland because you know Finland better than I, but if you look at, for example, France versus the UK, if you operate Invesdor in France, you are an investment intermediary, an advisor. And by law, you carry liabilities on the investment advice you do as platform investor. So if you invest as an investor in France on the crowdfunding platform that advertises a transaction, and something happens to this transaction and it loses money, and there's reason to believe that something wasn't done right, the crowdfunding platform, so the operator that operates, would have a liability to the investors. In the UK, this is not foreseen. Here you are a broker-dealer that just offers a transaction, but has no liability in the success of that. So it depends on the country you're operating in, how you are being perceived. But basically, usually the platform is a marketplace. The issuer of the securities that you might invest in is the company, and the company is liable in fulfilling all the regulatory requirements, prospectus or whatever there is. And the investor, of course, is the one who's charged with all the due diligence he has to do. Many crowdfunding platforms, of course, assist on both sides and ease that way. But in the end, it depends on the legal interpretation in your country of what the crowdfunding platform is liable for or not. So first, I saw him first, even though...
Okay, just following up on that, Oliver, do you see, are you advocating at European level in ECN good practice or best practice as regards countries, you're looking at their legislation, other member states, concession countries, on what works best? You mentioned the UK versus the French model, the caveat emptor versus top-down bureaucracy in France. Which seems to work or be popular with your members, that you can then go to the European institutions or member state governments and say, look, do it like this because it's working for the market in the replacement of equity investment?
In this case, the French were incredibly open. Just to usually the French are the ones that are top down, but I think it's the only country where the ministry has taken a public discussion and input from the market and the public before making decisions. So the French government has run crowdfunding conferences in the ministry now all these 3 times with 400 to 600 people, where the minister speaks and listens to the market. And so they were very open in listening to the industry. The result is still very French. And so far we have not lobbied for any specific regulation. I've never gone to the Commission and say, you should do it this way. There's two reasons. A, we have a very diverse membership, and if you're a crowdfunding platform in the UK, you will lobby for something very different than a German crowdfunding platform. And second, when I started this, my real hope was that we can circumnavigate the stupidity of national lawmaking and have a European directive, or at least a European issue of some form of communication to the national member states of how to harmonize this. Because we basically had a blank card. We didn't have regulation specifically for crowdfunding. We had existing regulation that could have easily been adapted in a positive way. But because we operate in Europe, the moment the Commission started talking about this, we have individual countries that need to profile themselves. And when the Italians regulated, the Brits and the French, we have to be the next ones. And no, but it is true, it's not, yeah? So the Commission came slightly too late with their communication, and they did a communication about 1 year ago, yeah? They communicated their opinion on crowdfunding. And the ESMA, the European Securities Market Authorities, communicated on crowdfunding about 6 months ago, or 7 months ago. The same for the European banking authorities, very clear what they think should be done. And they all basically say, this is a very exciting market, let's not create regulation that will harm its growth or hinder a European harmonized approach. Let's look at how we jointly can do this best together. And the result is that regulators or governments like the Germans say, F you, now we come with our own interpretation. And the more interpretations we have, the less likely it is to ever have a harmonized market. Point in case, if there's venture capitalists amongst you, it took 20 years to get a venture capital directive into European legislation. In countries like Germany, that means there's no professional venture capital market left. There's maybe 5 funds. There's a lot of non-professional people that call themselves venture capital funds. But if we look at the professionalism that was developed in the industry 15 years ago, and you look at the outfits that operate today, that is not the same. So there's no more institutional money that is managed on a professional way. There's no responsibility to the investors anymore. You have a lot of private wealth funds or family funds calling themselves venture capital. I think we lost a lot in that. And so at crowdfunding, we're only 3 years old. And even though we have now regulation in some countries, we still have liberty. So I stepped down from the board of ECN this summer. I was the founder, I was driving it. I stepped down because this is supposed to be an industry association. And an industry association has to lobby in the long term for a better regulation and harmonized practices according to best practices. Now I met Tero, one of our board members, and a lot of other people. And it's their job to understand that basically they all should sit down around the table and discuss what type of best practices can we do on a pan-European level. Are there certain elements in a standardized contract? And we had questions in Brussels from consumer protection agencies saying, do you have standardized contracts across Europe? And it's easy to identify 10 aspects that should be in every, and it's easy to identify 15 KPIs that every crowdfunding platform should publish on the right top side of their website, where you have an information sheet and you can see what type of transactions do they do and so on. And this is what the industry has to start doing now, where the regulation is more national and where it will be much more difficult to convince somebody on European level that there should be a harmonized approach. Add to that our new commissioner is not Commissioner Hill, as he should be known, but it's Lord Hill. So he's the English overlord from the City of London who loves private equity and asset management and doesn't care about fintech and crowdfunding. And so we have to even more work on bringing the discussion back onto this industry.
About
there was a woman on the side here. We love women.
Very simple question. What does this mean for the companies looking for funding? Are they, is that restricted as well? Looking at who can I use? Can I free to choose?
You mean across Europe?
Across Europe.
That basically depends on the regulation in individual countries and how platforms are structured. But in many cases it would require to set up a business in that location. There are some platforms that would allow you to raise funds on them. Seeders in the UK would allow you to go there fundraising, and they would then create a special purpose vehicle that would invest into your Finnish company. there's also the question if they have the license to do that, because they don't openly talk about this. So we have a company in Germany, Companisto, would also allow you to do that because they use a specific form of subordinated loan. So it's not equity, but it's loans with profit participation, kind of in between equity and not. They could do that as well. If that is a financial instrument that is of interest to you, I don't know. But there are these type of things, but all other platforms would require you to set up a business. And then our investor is, of course, through the license, being able to offer the opportunities. Alternativa in France, for example, potentially could do that, but doesn't do it. They just say we focus on our market. So this is still fairly limited. There's other platforms that have ignored regulation and said we just do it anyway, and operated in a country where the regulator said, well, we don't mind. Yeah? And basically for the last few years, this was in many countries the case where the regulator said, it's really interesting, let's look at it. I don't have time to really understand it, but we see how it grows, and then if we have to do something, we still can do it. So the German regulator, now we have a new regulation in Germany, openly says, no, we will not enforce anything. We know there's a new regulation. We don't have the time to look at it. We ourselves don't understand the new regulation yet. So no worries, we're not looking at you. But when we start looking, we better make sure that we have implemented according to the new regulation as of now, because we can also issue fines against you backdated. So suddenly the burden is on the crowdfunding platforms. The lawyers love that, they make a lot of money right now. Yeah. But this is basically how it has been so far. And I think now we see a little bit more pressure on some platforms because regulators start looking at it. As an investor or as an entrepreneur, yeah, it's basically you don't have a huge choice, but as an investor you are a little bit more open. As an investor you could invest more broadly. As an entrepreneur you would have to be very careful because you're liable as the issuer of the security. Your question there.
Yeah, it's a little related to the previous one. How do you organize the governance if you have like potentially hundreds of shareholders in the company, and then you have all these different regulations in countries? So how is it organized? Because it sounds like a nightmare.
I don't know, I've never done it. Many crowdfunding...
Because usually if you invest, you get to vote, you get to decide.
Yeah.
And I mean, how are these investors represented in a company?
So there's different models. You can be a shareholder in the company, like Crowdcube has been doing that for, I think, until now. So, and investors, right? So you, as a platform, you have not that much to do unless you help them do the financial reporting. But as a company, then you have, say, in the worst case, 238 shareholders that holds between 1 and 5 shares in your company. And you have to inform them once a year, maybe you're a bit more open, you inform them more often about the progress because you want them to invest again. And they become shareholders, and you have a general assembly, you have to invite them as shareholders, and they have a voting right. Now, other platforms have started to create special purpose vehicles. So all the investors are bundled in that special purpose vehicle that then is managed by the platform or by an independent party, but often the platform, and that special purpose vehicle invests in the target company. So that is the CEDAS model in the UK, which also in theory could allow them to invest across Europe. But it makes it very complicated for them as well because they actually have the management of the special purpose vehicle. And in other cases, you have other financial instruments that do not reside in an equity participation as a shareholder, and therefore you don't have the issue. So these are the ways that works. Basically, the management of the shareholders is the responsibility of the company, the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur needs to know if he wants many shareholders. It's probably easier for him to disregard their wishes because they don't have one strong voice. They will discuss amongst each other and he can just do what he wants. It's not as easy to sell it to a venture capitalist because they don't want to negotiate with 238 people. They say, no, my share is €1 more expensive than this share. And in the end, in the long term, it may not be the best way, but we don't know. People now tend to concentrate shareholding.
I have a question about the Americans. When will they come? Because essentially, crowdfunding is digitalizing finance.
we do business often, we have quite nice businesses in Europe, and then one day the Americans come, and then suddenly the business rules like with American companies. Will that happen in crowdfunding?
Equity crowdfunding.
Or
I don't know. I mean, I don't look too much at the Americans there. They have had the Jobs Act in 2012 telling them you will have crowdfunding. And they had a regulator that has successfully, since about 2 years now, ignored the decree from the ministry or from the government to implement equity crowdfunding. So they have strong reasons not to like it. We don't know exactly why. I think it's supposed to be now legalized at some point. We talk crowdfunding marketing securities to everybody, and also retail investors, whereas the US have the differentiation between retail and sophisticated investors, which the Brits have as well, but we don't usually have here on the continent. We have institutional investors, so it's a bank, a pension fund, or a corporate that manages assets, and then we have individuals. In the UK, US, you have the sophisticated investor. That's in the US, for example, the person that makes 100,000 euros, $100,000 a year plus, or 200,000, and you're rich. You may not be smart, but you're sophisticated enough to lose your money. This is how the Americans explain Madoff, for example. Yeah? I mean, it doesn't matter that they lost a few billions. That doesn't hurt them. So this is the American attitude. We don't have that here usually in Europe. Yeah? In Germany, you have to be a corporate. Then you can make investments, and as a private individual, that's restricted. So what they do in the US is club deals online. AngelList is a very good example. That works very well in the US. It doesn't work at all in Europe. AngelList has come to Europe. It may work a bit in the UK, but for example, in Germany, it's very hard for them to do any transactions because exactly of these kinds of regulations. So I wonder if in this market there will be a quick impact, because the Americans will, if they start doing it, scale under US laws. And when they come to Europe, they may not be able to duplicate the business model. Which is the same in the lending side as well. The Americans have a different regulation there. They can scale their business. They have, in their peer-to-peer lending in the US, is about 80% of the capital is hedge funds and family offices, which would be illegal right now in most European legislations. Or they would have to have certain licenses, which will make the operation far more expensive. So I don't know. This is also, we haven't seen any US platforms on that from that side coming to Europe, even though they are sizable. Maybe you're in luck. Any other questions? Good. Yeah.
One question. How do you see that shareholder different kind of regulations at the European level affecting the minority interest and protection regarding crowdfunding? Is there something happening there? Because for small investments, which are not typically crowdfunding investments, that is affecting how people are actually using it, and they are, how it's being conducted. Do you see that that's going to affect somehow the minority sort of, because they are, by definition, a minority. Do you think that's affecting that legislation?
It's difficult to say. I don't see in any country right now concerns within the regulatory discussion, but I don't follow every country. I mean, on European level, customer protection is always an issue, but not necessarily to that extent. In my experience, when you talk about with regulators and you talk about customer protection, in this case investor protection, it usually turns more into something like disabling your rights. So if I want to protect you as an investor, I will just forbid you to do something. And this is when you look at all the things that have happened in crowdfunding now in Germany. Crowdfunding now is legal, you can do equity crowdfunding, but you cannot invest more than 10,000 euros a year, because we just assume that it is not safe. And so there's no understanding that you may be smart enough to make the decision that you can manage your money, as you can buy a house or a car or whatever. But so they just restrict your ability. And with that way, in the UK, you have the same as an investor. You have to tick the box that says, I understand the risk that I can lose all my money. And if you actually lose your money, the regulator would say, well, no problem, you tick the box. Yeah. And so this is a kind of self-protection mechanism for them, and it makes it very easy to just disallow certain things. That is the type of regulation you would see. In Germany, it's praised as the Kleinanlegerschutzgesetz, so the small investors protection law, which would be what you want to hear, of course. Is where for crowdfunding, they just created an exemption that what you would like to see as equity crowdfunding cannot exist. It can only be subordinated loan structures, which by definition are the least protected ones, so customer protection is right at the back. And that's the only thing you can do. Because that is easy for the regulator to deal with, and the government doesn't have to change too many laws. There was already a loophole, and voila, everybody's happy. So this is reality. They're not going to define the best possible ways to protect you. They will look at what do we have, what is easy to implement, what doesn't create too much work for anybody, and that is the result that you will have. But, it's unfortunate. It's a reality. Thank you.